Europe. It never looks like much on a world map. A small corner of the old world, tucked gently between seas and mountains. But if you listen closely, if you slow your breath just a little, you can almost hear something old, something patient, moving beneath its soil. A quiet preparation, a long, deliberate shaping of destiny. Most continents shout their power. Europe whispered it. Its geography wasn't loud or dramatic like others. No endless deserts. No monstrous jungles. No impossible mountains. Europe was different. Soft on the outside, complicated on the inside. A small continent with a surprisingly tangled soul. Look closely and you'll see how this landscape carved the history we later read in books. Far to the south, the Alps rise like ancient guardians, white peaks cutting the sky, walls of ice and rock that shaped early migrations and separated cultures before those cultures even had names. To the east, the Carpathian Mountains form a long curved spine, holding back cold winds, and sometimes entire civilizations. Together, these mountains didn't isolate Europe, they organized it. They divided, guided, slowed, protected. They made sure no empire could swallow everything too quickly. They forced growth to happen in pieces, in little worlds, in parallel experiments of culture and thought. And between those mountains, rivers began their quiet work. Rivers, Europe's true storytellers. The Rhine River, winding like a steel blue thread from the mountains to the northern seas. The Danube River, stretching across half the continent like a calm, determined road. The Seine River, gentle and reflective, carrying the heartbeat of future cities along its banks. These rivers were not just rivers, they were slow roads of history. Paths that didn't rush. Paths that allowed villages to become towns, and towns to become centers of trade, thought, and ambition. If you quietly stand beside a European river at dawn, even today, the old rhythm, the creaking of early wooden boats, the murmur of merchants arguing about grain and wine, the soft, hopeful noise of a continent discovering the power of connection. These rivers didn't create wealth, they created possibility. They made it easier for farmers to move grain, for craftsmen to move goods, for ideas to drift from valley to valley until they found someone ready to listen. They gave Europe something priceless: time, stability, and a slow, steady rise. Then there was the coast, the long, jagged, generous coast. Unlike many parts of the world, Europe's coastline is not one simple curve. It's a puzzle of peninsulas, inlets, bays, and islands, each piece offering a place to anchor ships, build harbors, and open doors to the world. Natural harbors became towns, those towns became ports, and those ports became gateways to trade, travel, and early wealth. The sea offered danger, yes, but it also offered opportunity. It whispered to their curiosity, tempted their ambition, and slowly taught them that the world was bigger than the horizon they knew. Climate played its part too. Europe's weather, mild, forgiving, patient, became a quiet blessing. The rain came often but not too hard. The summers warmed gently, just enough for crops to thrive. The winters were cold, but not cruel enough to break society. This climate didn't rush growth, it nurtured it. Fields became plentiful, harvests grew dependable, families could plan, communities could expand, and for the first time in human history, people had the space to think beyond survival. Then came the forests. Thick, dark, ancient forests that once covered most of the continent, a place of wolves and mystery, but also a reservoir of the resource that would shape Europe's early path: wood. Wood for warmth. Wood for homes. Wood for fortresses. Wood for ships. Those forests gave Europe its first fleets, small at first, fragile and hesitant, but over generations, stronger, faster, more daring. And with every generation, these forests whispered to the people, you can build, you can travel, you can seek, you can learn. Geography was not a background, it was a teacher. The mountains taught division and protection. The rivers taught patience and connection. The seas taught courage and exploration. The forests taught craftsmanship and expansion. And the mild climate allowed all of this to unfold slowly, without fear of collapse. Europe did not rise quickly. It rose in fragments, small kingdoms, tiny duchies, little city-states, each one fighting, arguing, competing for survival, and accidentally pushing innovation forward. Competition became the engine, geography became the guide, and together they formed a continent that didn't rush toward greatness, but prepared for it. 1,000 quiet years of steady growth beneath the surface. Europe wasn't destined for power. It was shaped for it, silently, patiently, by the very land beneath its feet. If you travel deeper into Europe's early landscape, you'll notice something subtle, almost hidden. The land wasn't just giving resources. It was shaping behavior, molding temperament, training societies, quietly, for the long game. Because when life isn't too harsh, and not too easy either, people have time to think. Time to craft tools a little better. Time to plan a little further. Time to build something that might outlive them. And Europe's geography allowed exactly that. Its fragmented valleys and winding rivers created small pockets of identity. Languages formed, customs evolved, and tiny rivalries took root. These rivalries weren't meaningless. They were pressure. Pressure that created movement. Movement that sparked invention. It's strange how competition, when held within boundaries, can become a blessing. Instead of one giant empire crushing everything beneath it, Europe grew like a mosaic. Piece by piece, culture by culture, each region trying to outdo the other in trade, in craft, in thought, in exploration. Sometimes in war, yes, but even conflict pushed people to learn, adapt, improve. This mosaic made Europe restless in a careful way, ambitious in a cautious way, curious in a disciplined way. All because the land itself forced them to grow small before they grew strong. And the rivers, those calm, patient lifelines, kept teaching them the same lesson. Move slowly, but move. Travel along the Rhine in your imagination. Picture small wooden houses leaning over the water. Men carrying sacks of salt and grain. A trader whispering a new idea to a stranger from far away. A blacksmith forging a tool slightly better than the last one. A fisherman staring into the current, watching how the river flows, learning something without even realizing it. All of this happening quietly. No grand announcement. No dramatic turning point. Just steady progress carried by water. Day after day. Year after year. Follow the Danube and you'll find the same rhythm. Different faces. Different languages. But the same slow-building heartbeat. The same truth. Geography was shaping them, even when they weren't aware of it. And the coastlines, Europe's long, jagged invitation to the world, kept bending cultures outward. Harbors turned into listening posts of civilization. Ships brought stories from distant places. Lands. Merchants carried spices, fabrics, and whispers of new ideas. And every whisper left a seed behind. You can almost imagine an old sailor returning to a northern port after months at sea, telling a group of villagers about a strange device he saw in a faraway market, or a new style of bridge, or a technique for storing grain. And somewhere in that crowd, one young man listening too closely, thinking too hard, dreaming too big. Innovation always begins like that, small, accidental, quiet. Europe's climate played the softest yet most influential role. Crops grew consistently. Harvests rarely failed on a continental scale. People lived long enough to pass down their craft. Families gathered enough surplus to invest in better tools, better homes, better futures. And when survival isn't the only priority, humans start imagining, start building, start seeking meaning. You can almost feel that gentle shift if you imagine a village evening hundreds of years ago. The sky dimming over a field of wheat. Children laughing as they run past wooden fences. An old farmer sitting on a stool sharpening his tools, thinking, we can do this better next year. That thought, so simple, so humble, became Europe's quiet strength. A belief in improvement. Not sudden, not miraculous, just steady. The forests that once seemed endless added their own chapter to this story. It's easy to forget. Wood was Europe's first currency of power. From carpentry to warfare, from bridges to ships, from heat to shelter, everything began with trees. But more than that, forests gave them imagination. Children grew up hearing the groans of ancient branches. Hunters walked paths so old that even the deer seemed to know the stories. Symbols into bark. believing the forest watched over them. And in those forests, humans learned patience. You can't rush a tree to grow. You can only shape what nature gives. That mindset of shaping rather than overpowering became part of Europe's early character. And slowly, so slowly you could miss it if you weren't paying attention, these scattered communities began connecting. Through rivers, through trade routes, through coastal journeys that traced the edges of the continent like threads stitching a tapestry. Each connection added something. A new skill, a new tool, a new story, a new ambition. Then something remarkable happened, not in one moment but across centuries. These tiny kingdoms and city-states began raising their heads, looking outward, comparing themselves, competing harder, trading more, thinking bigger. It was not geography alone that changed Europe. It was geography combined with human restlessness, human frustration, human dreams. People living in close proximity, with just enough resources to experiment and just enough rivalry to push them further. This created a pressure cooker of innovation. You can imagine a blacksmith in a crowded town, hammering iron late at night, knowing the craftsman in the next valley is trying to make something better. Imagine a farmer testing a new technique because he heard a rumor that another village doubled their yield. Imagine a shipbuilder staring at a half-finished hull, trying to solve a problem he cannot explain to anyone else. This is how Europe grew, not through grand empires first, but through thousands of tiny improvements carried by ordinary people. And all the while, the land stayed silent, watching, shaping, preparing. Europe wasn't destined to rise quickly. It wasn't designed for sudden greatness, slow accumulation, for layering strength upon strength, knowledge upon knowledge, generation upon generation, until one day the world looked up and realized the small continent had become something far larger than its size. Geography didn't give Europe power. It gave Europe time, space, pressure, opportunity, and a path built not on miracles, but on quiet preparation. 1,000 years of silence before the noise began. If you close your eyes and let the world grow quiet, you can almost hear it. A soft echo, fading across thousands of years, carried by marble pillars, broken statues, forgotten temples, and dusty old manuscripts. Europe did not begin with kings or kingdoms. It began with ideas, with questions, with the quiet courage to wonder. Long before the continent knew wealth or power, the lands around the ancient Greece were humming with something invisible, a new way of thinking. In the small city-states of Greece, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, people gathered in open squares under the warmth of the Mediterranean sun and dared to ask questions no one had asked before. What is truth? What is justice? Why are we here? How does the world work? Can reason guide us? These questions were gentle at first, like ripples across water, but slowly they became waves that shaped the entire future of Europe. This was not the loud influence of conquest or armies, it was a quiet influence, philosophy, logic, curiosity. The Greeks gave Europe its first gift, a mind that wanted to understand, not just survive. You could almost imagine an old Greek philosopher sitting beside a stone column, watching the shadows stretch across the ground, whispering to a young student, "Don't accept the world as it is. Ask why. Ask how." From that whisper came logic. From logic came science. From science came the first sparks of a continent that would one day reshape the world. But ideas alone cannot build a civilization. For that, Europe needed something stronger, something more organized, something that could turn thought into structure. And that force rose in the West, a growing power built on discipline, ambition, and order. It began as a small settlement beside the Tiber River. Humble, unremarkable, just another community trying to survive. But slowly, steadily, with the same kind of patience the rivers taught Europe, it grew. Rome did not rise because it was the smartest. It rose because it understood people. It understood structure. It understood the art of weaving thousands of lives into one powerful system. Roads stretched out from the capital like veins carrying life, straight, disciplined, unstoppable. Some of those roads still remain, stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Laws were carved into tablets, clear and firm, not as commands of a king, but as the framework of a society. Citizenship created identity, administration created stability, taxation created resources, cities created community. Rome transformed Europe not with whispers, but with architecture, with organization, with the belief that chaos could be shaped, and shaped beautifully. You can almost picture a Roman engineer standing beside a half-built aqueduct, looking at the arches stretching into the distance, thinking, water will flow here for 100 generations. That kind of thinking, long-term, structured, purposeful, became Europe's skeleton. Yet even the greatest empires fall. When Rome collapsed, it was not a quiet event. It was thunder. Cities abandoned, roads broken, markets silent, people scattered. Europe plunged into confusion, unsure of what remained. But here is the quiet truth that history often forgets. When a structure falls, its foundation remains. Rome's cities crumbled, but the idea of cities survived. Its armies disappeared, but the concept of order remained. Its empire shattered, but its laws lived on beneath the rubble. Its administration vanished, but the memory of organization still breathed inside. Small kingdoms trying to rebuild. And beneath it all, beneath the ruins, beneath the fear, beneath the darkness, the Greek way of thinking continued like an ember that refused to die, to question, to reason, to seek knowledge. The Greek mind and the Roman structure, two gifts from two ancient worlds, became seeds buried deep in Europe's soil. For a time they slept, quiet and forgotten, but they were still alive, waiting, resting, preparing to return in a new age, when Europe would once again open its eyes. When Rome fell, the noise was loud, but the silence that followed was even louder. Across the continent, people looked around and saw broken roads, burned libraries, empty forums, and cities that no longer felt like the centers of the world. For many, it felt like the lights of knowledge had gone out, like Europe had exhaled and forgotten to inhale again. But even in that darkness, something faint remained. Not in the stone buildings or crumbling walls, but in memory. A farmer who had never seen a Roman city still lived under a taxation system inspired by Roman order. A village council meeting in a small wooden hall unknowingly followed the shadow of Roman administration. A monk copying texts late at night was preserving Greek ideas without ever hearing the voices behind them. The ancient world survived through echo, through faint reflections, through fragments carried quietly across generations. In small monasteries tucked away in mountains, old manuscripts lay hidden. Greek philosophy, Roman law, scientific observations, fragments of poetry, bits of logic. The monks didn't fully understand the treasure they were protecting. They only knew that the words were important, and so they copied them, page after page, candle by candle, night after night, keeping something ancient alive. Outside those walls, life was harsh and chaotic. Kingdoms shifted, tribes fought. Villages struggled to survive long winters. But beneath the noise, the foundations of Europe were slowly warming again, waiting for the right moment. And that moment began with a whisper of memory. People rediscovered old roads and repaired them. They looked at broken aqueducts and wondered how such things were made. They found old Roman coins buried in mud and felt a strange sense of longing for something bigger than their small world. Memory is powerful. It can rebuild a civilization long after the civilization is gone. Slowly, very slowly, Europe began to reconnect with the mind it had lost. Through trade, through travel, through stories. Through the handful of educated men and women who still preserved fragments of ancient wisdom. And one day, a simple realization came to the continent. We have been here before. We once understood more than we understand now. That realization became a spark that inspired scholars to search for ancient texts, a spark that encouraged kings to rebuild roads and restore laws, a spark that led curious young minds to ask questions that had not been asked in centuries. Who are we? Where did we come from? What knowledge have we lost? What wisdom still waits to be rediscovered? These questions were almost the same questions the Greeks had asked, and the moment Europe asked them again, the ancient world breathed. Greek curiosity awakened, Roman structure re-emerged. Ideas long buried rose like dawn light over ruins. You can almost picture a young student sitting in a dimly lit room, reading a rediscovered manuscript for the first time, seeing words written 1,000 years ago, feeling the presence of minds that refused to die. That is how heritage works. Quietly, steadily, passing through hands, not through armies. The Greeks left Europe a way to think. The Romans left Europe a way to build. And even after centuries of silence, those gifts remained, hidden, waiting, but intact. They would soon guide Europe into a new age, a rebirth, a reawakening, when the ancient whispers would turn into a chorus, and a sleeping continent would rise again. Not as Greece, not as Rome, but as Europe. A civilization standing on the shoulders of worlds that came before it. There was a time when Europe felt like it was fading. Not dying, but dimming. Like a candle left in the wind, still burning, but flickering hard to stay alive. After the fall of Rome, the continent slipped into a long, heavy night. Villages emptied, cities shrank. Diseases swept through lands already weakened by hunger and war. People stopped traveling, stopped learning, stopped dreaming. It was a world where survival pushed everything else aside. And slowly, almost without realizing it, Europe forgot parts of itself. Libraries decayed, schools collapsed. Knowledge that once flowed freely became a thin trickle, then a few drops, and in some places, nothing at all. This is what we now call the Dark Ages. Not because there was no light, but because the light was small, scattered, fragile. Yet darkness is never complete. Not in history, not in the human heart. Far away, in the bustling cities of the Middle East, knowledge was not fading, it was rising. Scholars there were preserving ancient Greek manuscripts, studying them, expanding them. They explored mathematics, medicine, astronomy, chemistry, philosophy. They measured the stars, mapped the earth, healed diseases, calculated numbers Europe had forgotten how to use. And at the edges of Europe, in the vibrant world of Al-Andalus, something extraordinary was happening. A meeting of cultures, languages, and minds. In its libraries, thousands of books glowed like torches against the darkness. Books about science, books about medicine, books about logic and geometry. Books that held the memory of civilizations Europe no longer remembered. Trade routes brought travelers, traders, students, carrying stories, carrying curiosity, carrying words that had crossed deserts and seas. And then, slowly, a gentle movement began. Not a battle, not a revolution, a translation. In quiet rooms lit by oil lamps, scholars of different faiths, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, sat side by side, copying, translating, preserving. They translated works of Aristotle, Galen, Euclid. They preserved texts on algebra, optics, anatomy, astronomy. They carried ancient Greek ideas through Arabic explanations into Latin manuscripts, and from there back into Europe. It was like passing a flame from one hand to another, carefully, so it would not go out. This translation movement did not announce itself. There were no celebrations, no fanfare. Just quiet pages turning, pens scratching, ideas moving from one language into another, knowledge finding its way home. And as these translated books traveled north, something shifted inside Europe. A gentle stirring, a small awakening. Scholars reopened abandoned schools. Monasteries began collecting manuscripts again. Young minds discovered ideas their ancestors had lost centuries earlier. A new breath entered the continent. Soft, cautious, curious. And with that breath, Europe began to rise from its long sleep. As the translated books reached Europe, the continent felt something it hadn't felt in centuries. A gentle warmth. Not sunlight, but understanding. In monasteries tucked away behind stone walls, monks once again bent over wooden desks, copying pages with slow, careful strokes. In small towns, teachers dusted off abandoned classrooms and began explaining ideas that sounded almost magical to the ears of their students. Numbers behaved in new ways. Stars followed patterns no one had noticed before. The human body became a map worth exploring. The world felt a little bigger, and Europe felt a little less alone. This wasn't a loud awakening. It was more like the way morning light touches a window, soft at first, almost shy, almost unsure. But once it begins, it doesn't stop. Curiosity swept across the continent like a quiet breeze. People started asking questions again, questions that had been silent for too long. What lies beyond the horizon? How does the body work? Why do the planets move the way they do? What is beauty? What is truth? These questions didn't just awaken minds, they awakened a spirit. A hunger for learning, for understanding, for rediscovering a world that had been lost in shadow. And slowly, something began to grow. A subtle glow, spreading from city to city. Florence, Venice, Milan. A glow that would one day be called the Renaissance. Before great paintings or great discoveries, the Renaissance began as a feeling, a lifting of heaviness, a soft breath of possibility, a belief that the world could be more than mud and war and cold winters. Painters leaned closer to their canvases, suddenly wanting to capture light in new ways. Scientists watched the sky with a patience that felt almost sacred. Poets wrote lines about the human soul, as if they were rediscovering it for the very first time. It was subtle, it was fragile, but it was real. And then, a sound changed everything. A small, rhythmic clatter, like soft thunder in a quiet room. A printing press. For the first time in European history, knowledge didn't depend on the slow hands of a monk or the survival of a single manuscript. Ideas could multiply, words could travel, books could reach thousands, dozens. Knowledge, finally, became fast. A continent that had once forgotten how to learn now found itself flooded with thoughts, discoveries, stories, diagrams, theories, dreams. Every new page printed was like a flicker of light pushing the darkness further back. And with each flicker, Europe grew brighter. Art blossomed, science advanced, exploration expanded. People began believing in possibility again. This rebirth was not sudden. It did not shout. It whispered. It flowed gently, like water finding its path. The Renaissance was Europe remembering who it used to be. Curious like Greece, organized like Rome, and now, hopeful in a new way. It planted seeds that would take centuries to grow, seeds that would one day lead to inventions, revolutions, and an age of knowledge unlike anything the world had ever seen. All of it began with darkness, and all of it grew because someone, somewhere, kept a light alive long enough for morning to find its way back. The story of Europe turning toward the sea does not begin with a single moment. It begins with a feeling, a quiet restlessness that lived inside a small continent, surrounded by ancient mountains, cold winds, and long memories of survival. For centuries, Europe lived mostly inward, in villages, towns, farmlands, narrow roads, and small markets. Life was simple, predictable, confined. People traded with their neighbors, harvested their crops, and listened to stories brought by travelers who walked across deserts and mountains. But the world beyond Europe was enormous, filled with spices, silks, perfumes, metals, and wonders that seemed almost unreal. Merchants who came from distant lands spoke of cities bigger than anything Europe had seen, of palaces decorated with gold, of bazaars where thousands of people traded goods from every corner of the earth. European kings and merchants listened, and they started to dream. Not loudly, not boldly, just a quiet desire, like a small flame burning in the corner of a dark room. The desire for spices was the turning point. It sounds strange today, but in the past, spices were treasure. Pepper could buy land. Cinnamon could buy loyalty. Cloves could buy protection. Nutmeg was worth more than its weight in gold. Spices preserved food, healed illness, added flavor, and symbolized status. Everyone wanted them. But there was a problem. The road to get them was long and dangerous. Caravans crossed deserts, mountains, hostile territories, and powerful empires. Each time the goods changed hands, the price climbed higher. By the time spices reached Europe, they were luxuries only the wealthy could afford. And slowly, a thought began to grow. What if Europe found its own route? A route no one else controlled. A route across the open sea. It was an impossible idea at first. The sea was fear. Storms swallowed ships whole. Monsters were drawn on maps because no one knew what lived in the deep. But fear and curiosity often live side by side, and eventually, curiosity wins. Along the western edge of Europe, small kingdoms began to look at the ocean differently. The waves that once seemed like a barrier now seemed like a door. A vast, swinging door waiting to be opened. Portugal felt it first, a thin, quiet country pressed against the Atlantic. Its fishermen had always gone a little farther than others, feeling the pull of the currents, learning how the wind behaved, understanding the moods of the tide. Portuguese shipbuilders began to experiment. Lighter wood, triangular sails, flexible masts. The caravel was born, a ship designed not for comfort, but for endurance. A ship that could dance with the wind instead of fighting it. It was small but brave, like the people who built it. And so Portugal began to creep down the coast of Africa. Not rushing, just exploring, learning, step by step, cape by cape, storm by storm. These early voyages were not grand or dramatic. No huge conquests, no magnificent discoveries. Just quiet persistence, like someone patiently tracing the edge of a map that had never been drawn before. Meanwhile, inland Europe was changing too. Trade was growing, kingdoms were competing, merchants were becoming powerful voices. Everyone wanted wealth, influence, and advantage, and the sea was becoming the path toward all three. Spain, watching its neighbor Portugal carve ocean routes, felt a different desire, not to go around Africa, but to go west, into the enormous blue unknown. It was a gamble that could cost lives, ships, reputations. But Europe had reached a point where the old paths were no longer enough. It needed new ones, new ideas, new risks, and so ships began to move into the Atlantic. Not many at first, just a handful, sailing with fear in their hearts and hope in their sails. These early sailors lived lives of hardship most people today cannot imagine. Months without land, salt water burning their skin, rations shrinking day by day. The creaking of wooden beams, the constant rhythm of waves hitting the bow like an ancient heartbeat. Night after night, they looked at the stars, their only guide. Stars that had watched humanity long before maps existed. Stars that silently showed the way across the endless water. When they finally reached new lands, the world shifted. Not instantly, but slowly, like a tide beginning to rise. Europe found new shores, new people, new plants, new minerals, new routes. Every discovery, every harbor, every coastline became part of a vast system that was being born across oceans. But with exploration came something deeper, something heavier. The beginning of colonization. A long chapter where Europe would extend its hands across continents, sometimes to trade, sometimes to conquer, sometimes to reshape entire worlds. Yet in these early moments, before empires, before plantations, before the flow of gold and silver, there was only quiet wonder, a sense that the planet was larger than anyone had imagined, a sense that the sea was not empty, but full of possibilities. Ships returned to European ports carrying spices, metals, new foods, and stories so extraordinary that ordinary people could barely believe them. Peppers that burned the tongue, cocoa that darkened drinks, roots that smelled like perfume. Markets changed, tastes changed, ambitions changed. Europe began to understand something profound. The sea was not simply a space, it was a road. A road no king could fully own. A road no army could block. A road that connected distant worlds in a way that land routes never could. As ships became more common, harbors grew busier. Sails filled the skyline. The sound of ropes, pulleys, waves, and shouting sailors became the heartbeat of coastal towns. And behind it all, the ocean rolled on, deep, wide, ancient, indifferent. It watched as small European kingdoms reached out across the world, seeking wealth, seeking power, seeking something they could not yet describe. The age of sea voyages had begun, not with a single moment of glory, but with centuries of quiet movement, one ship at a time, one coastline at a time, one uncertain voyage after another. And in that slow unfolding, Europe found the beginning of a path that would change its destiny forever. When oceans became highways, and Europe quietly transformed through global trade, long routes, and the steady pulse of maritime power, the sea changed everything. slowly, quietly, almost without anyone noticing at first. What began as a few daring voyages soon became a rhythm that echoed across an entire continent. Ships no longer left Europe as rare events. They left like the tides, constant, predictable, steady. Ports grew louder, markets grew larger, and Europe, once a cluster of small kingdoms, found itself connected to lands so distant that they seemed like another world. But the transformation did not happen suddenly, in waves. The first wave was curiosity. The second was profit. And profit has a way of pulling nations, merchants, and kings into motion. As explorers mapped coastlines and recorded wind patterns, Europe realized something subtle but powerful. The ocean was predictable. Not safe, never safe, but understandable. Sailors learned how the Atlantic behaved during different seasons. They learned where storms gathered, where currents carried ships naturally, where winds shifted like clockwork. Knowledge grew, and knowledge became advantage. Merchants who once relied on caravan routes across deserts now invested in ships, ports, warehouses. The ocean became the world's newest marketplace, vast, borderless, and full of risk. But every risk carried the promise of reward. Europe's wealth in the early days did not come from factories or machines. It came from sails. White cloth stretching above wooden decks, billowing in the wind like the lungs of a continent learning to breathe differently. As voyages increased, so did Europe's presence overseas. Coastal fortresses appeared along foreign shores, small at first, little more than stone outposts, but they marked something larger, the beginning of influence far beyond Europe's natural borders. A ship might leave Lisbon or Seville with 100 men, a hold full of metal, and a prayer whispered under breath. Months later, it might return with spices, gold, ivory, exotic woods, or stories of lands no European had ever described before. These goods reshaped Europe. New foods entered European kitchens. New fabrics entered markets. New scents drifted through the homes of rich merchants. Tea warmed cold winters. Coffee fueled conversations. Chocolate became a luxury. Sugar transformed tastes. Each of these items carried with it the weight of distant labor and invisible connections, ties that Europe rarely acknowledged, yet depended on for its growing prosperity. As trade deepened, something else emerged. Not just voyages, but systems, networks. Europe built web-like chains of ports, warehouses, agents, and agreements that stretched across continents. Ships sailed in scheduled patterns. Harbors bustled with predictable arrivals, and merchants learned how to calculate profit not from a single journey, but from an entire cycle of trade that spun like a wheel. The wheel of global commerce. And once that wheel began to move, it did not stop. Along the coast of West Africa, European presence expanded. Along the shores of South Asia, trading posts turned into fortified cities. Across the Caribbean and the American continents, plantations emerged, first small, then vast, then monstrous in scale. The world did not grow smaller. Europe simply began to reach farther. Massive ships loaded with sugar, cotton, tobacco, silver, and gold sailed eastward toward Europe's hungry markets. In return, Europe exported cloth, metal, weapons, tools, and its growing ambition. But behind this movement, there was another story, a story of people taken across oceans in chains, labor extracted through force, cultures transformed or erased, lands reshaped without consent. Even in calm sleep storytelling tone, the truth remains. Wealth has shadows. And Europe's rise glimmered with those shadows. But in Europe itself, the perception was different. People saw ships returning full, cities growing richer, docks expanding, markets filled with items once unimaginable. Nations celebrated their discoveries, rarely considering the regions being altered by their presence. At sea, the ships themselves became symbols of a new age. Huge vessels with tall masts, thick ropes, barrels stacked below decks, cannons lined on the sides. Floating worlds carrying hundreds of souls. Each voyage felt like a lifetime. Months of silence, storms, boredom, fear, and hope. The ocean had its own language. A creak of wood meant tension. A sudden change of wind meant danger. The cry of a lookout meant land. Sailors slept beside cargo, ate salted meat, drank stale water, and told stories to keep the nights from swallowing their minds. Yet these hardships did not slow the momentum. Europe needed more. More goods, more routes, more power, more presence, and so the voyages multiplied. In London, Amsterdam, and Lisbon, powerful merchant associations transformed into something bigger. Companies, not ordinary businesses, but massive institutions with charters granted by kings, rights to wage war, control ports, command fleets, and rule territories thousands of miles away. These companies blurred the line between business and sovereignty. They negotiated with kings and conquered villages in the same breath. Their ships were not just traders, they were floating cities of influence, agents of an expanding world system. Back in Europe, people felt the effects without realizing the scale. New jobs appeared: dock workers, warehouse keepers, ship carpenters, rope makers, map illustrators, sea captains. These jobs fed families, fed cities, fed nations. The economy grew like a quiet tide rising in darkness, invisible at first, then undeniable. This expansion reshaped Europe's identity. Countries competed fiercely, funding expeditions, building navies, protecting routes. Sea power became national pride. A strong navy meant security, influence, and the ability to protect trade. And as Europe's fleets grew, something subtle happened. The continent became the center of a global network. Not geographically. Geographically, Europe was still small. But economically, politically, strategically, Europe was becoming the crossroads of the world. Ships arriving from Asia, Africa, and the Americas all unloaded their goods at European ports. Markets in Europe decided prices for commodities grown oceans away. Coins minted in Europe influenced trade thousands of miles distant. Policies made in European capitals changed the fate of people who had never seen Europe. It was a quiet revolution, a tidal shift, the beginning of global interconnectedness. But for sailors at sea, life remained a blend of hardship and wonder. They saw coastlines unknown to their families. They learned the constellations of the southern hemisphere. They crossed waters so clear they could see the ocean floor, and storms so dark they couldn't see their own hands. Some never returned home. Their names were never recorded in any book, never celebrated in any hall. Yet they were threads in the vast fabric of history, threads without which the fabric would tear. As Europe's voyages continued, entire ecosystems changed. Plants were moved across continents, animals traveled across oceans, diseases spread, sometimes devastating entire populations. But alongside destruction came exchange. Foods like potatoes, tomatoes, maize, and cocoa transformed European diets. Horses, wheat, and sugarcane transformed American landscapes. The world was becoming intertwined in ways no one fully understood. And at the center of this change stood the sea, silent, powerful, endless, a witness to every hope and every tragedy, a bridge between worlds that once lived apart. Europe did not become wealthy overnight. Its rise was built on centuries of voyages, layers of trade, systems of extraction, and the slow construction of global networks. Every ship that sailed out carried a small piece of Europe's future. Every ship that returned brought back a piece of the world. And through this constant exchange, Europe grew. Not merely in wealth, but in influence. Not merely in markets, but in mindset. Europe began to see itself not as a corner of the world, but as a center of it. The ocean had given Europe a path carved by wind and wave, danger and discovery, ambition and consequence. And as the sails filled with wind and the ships moved across the horizon, a new chapter of global history unfolded, one silent voyage at a time. Steam, factories, labor, and the quiet economic explosion that reshaped Europe. The first sound was almost nothing. Not a bang, not a roar, not a dramatic moment in history. Just a faint hum. A shaky, uncertain vibration from a small machine, somewhere in the quiet British countryside. No one knew then that this tiny sound was the beginning of a transformation that would reshape everything Europe understood about work, wealth, society, and power. It didn't start with factories, or railways, or tall chimneys rising like iron fingers into the sky. It started with something far more ordinary: the ground beneath Europe. A ground rich with two hidden treasures, coal and iron. For centuries they lay quietly underground, waiting. waiting for a moment when human curiosity would dig deep enough, experiment long enough, fail often enough, to unlock their potential. Europe didn't become the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution because of luck. It happened because the continent had the right mixture of ingredients: resources, people, ideas, habits, and small sparks of innovation that slowly added up. Coal was the first spark. Black, dirty, heavy, yet full of energy. Unlike wood, it burned hotter, longer, stronger. And iron made tools that didn't break easily. Tools that allowed people to build machines. But at this early stage, there were no iconic factories yet. No massive machines. Just scattered experiments. A handful of inventors working alone with candlelight, metal scraps, and stubborn determination. One machine, however, changed everything. The steam engine. Not the polished, powerful version that would later power trains and factories, but the crude, clunky, unreliable early versions that barely worked, spat steam like angry beasts, and needed constant fixing. Still, it was enough. Enough to make people imagine that human strength and animal strength were no longer the limits of what could be done. Steam meant power. Power that did not tire, did not sleep, did not complain. A quiet revolution began to breathe. Work moved indoors. Water wheels became engines. Workshops became mills. Mills became factories. At first, these buildings were small. Wooden frames, simple rooms. But inside them, the rhythm of Europe changed. Instead of the calm pace of village life, there was a new tempo, a mechanical heartbeat. Metal striking metal, belts turning, wheels spinning, steam hissing softly like a sleeping giant. It wasn't dramatic. It was repetitive, hypnotic, endless, and slowly people moved. Villagers who had worked on farms for generations walked toward the growing towns. Towns turned into cities. Cities turned into industrial centers with crowded streets, the smell of burning coal, and skies that grew darker every year. For many, this move was not a choice. Agricultural changes pushed them out. Factories pulled them in. A new class of workers formed, men, women, and even children, who spent long hours beside machines that never stopped. Handmade tools and slow seasons began to fade behind them. And something new took its place. Factories multiplied. Mills multiplied. The demand for coal skyrocketed. Europe dug deeper and deeper, mines expanding like underground cities. In these mines, beneath the earth, men worked in darkness so thick they carried their own light. They mined the fuel that kept the continent moving, a constant, heavy sacrifice for the growing appetite of industry. Above ground, ironworks glowed like volcanoes. Workers hammered molten metal, shaping it into rails, beams, machines, engines. Pieces of a world being rebuilt. And soon, rails stretched across the landscape. Trains arrived with a deep, thunderous breath. They were loud, smoky, massive. But their arrival changed the continent forever. Before railways, travel was slow. Trade was slower. Everything relied on horses, carts, and the rhythm of nature. But trains cared nothing for nature. They moved through rain, fog, night. They were faster than anyone had imagined possible. For the first time, goods could travel across entire countries in hours instead of days. Farmers could send their crops to distant markets. Factories could deliver products far beyond their local towns. Merchants could plan shipments with accuracy. It was as if Europe had suddenly shrunk. Cities pulled closer, regions connected, economies intertwined. Internal trade exploded. Europe, once a patchwork of isolated economies, became a vast, interconnected engine of production. And behind this engine was mass production.
A few items. They produced thousands. Textiles, metal tools, shoes, furniture, weapons, household goods. Objects that once took days or weeks to make could now be produced in minutes. For the first time in human history, ordinary people could afford things that had once been luxuries. Clothes became cheaper. Basic tools became common. Everyday life changed in tiny, almost invisible ways. But these tiny changes added up to a new standard of living. With more goods came more trade. With more trade came more profit. With more profit came something Europe had never experienced at this scale: structured finance. Banks expanded. Insurance companies formed. Loan systems developed. Investments became normal. People pooled money for railways, factories, ships.
Money multiplied, wealth circulated, projects grew larger, profits grew faster. Europe had built a feedback loop. Industry created wealth, wealth funded industry. Industry expanded wealth even further. It was quiet, gradual, but unstoppable. And the cities continued to swell. Narrow streets turned into crowded neighborhoods. Workers lived in cheap housing, often in grim conditions. Polluted air, unsafe water, overflowing waste. But even in these hardships, opportunity existed. A farm did not offer wages. A factory did. And wages meant choice. Small choices at first, but choices nonetheless. Every family moving into the city entered a new chapter of European society. Every worker stepping into a factory added strength to the continent's industrial rise. Architects of this rise were not just inventors or factory owners. They were these workers, ordinary people breathing in coal dust air, listening to the endless hum of machines, and unknowingly shaping the future. The Industrial Revolution was not loud. Not at the beginning. It was not heroic or dramatic. It was mechanical, routine, repetitive. The same motion, repeated thousands of times until it reshaped a continent. Yet beneath the monotony was momentum. Europe was changing from the inside out. Economies were expanding, production was rising, cities were growing, and wealth was multiplying. By the time the rest of the world noticed, Europe had already taken the lead. The hum of machines had become the heartbeat of a new era. An era of steam, an era of iron, an era of ambition, forged in the quiet corners of factories, where the air shimmered with heat, and the future waited just beyond the smoke. The quiet hum of machines did not begin with a sudden roar. It began like a faint vibration beneath the soil of Europe. A soft tremor, an almost unnoticed whisper of gears, iron, coal, and human curiosity. In the 18th century, Europe found itself standing on the edge of a transformation, though most people living at that time would not have realized what was about to come. The world they knew, fields, villages, handmade tools, slow roads, and quiet markets, was preparing to shift into an entirely different rhythm. The question of why the Industrial Revolution happened specifically in Europe is one that historians still explore. But for our calm, sleep-guided journey tonight, we will follow the gentle threads that quietly wove themselves together. Europe had something unique beneath its green hills, an abundance of coal and iron ore. These two simple elements, black stone and reddish metal, would become the backbone of a new age. Coal could burn hotter and longer than wood. Iron could be shaped into strong machines. Together, they formed the silent foundation of an industrial awakening. In small workshops and modest sheds, inventors experimented with new ideas. They were not grand laboratories or magnificent halls, just quiet rooms filled with the soft scratch of metal tools, the gentle hiss of steam, and the hopeful eyes of artisans trying to solve small problems that unknowingly would change the world. One of the most important developments was the steam engine. Early versions existed before the famous names entered history. These first engines were clumsy, heavy, and inefficient, but they began a gentle shift. They showed that steam, something as soft and invisible as a morning mist, could become a force powerful enough to move metal. As steam engines improved, they spread slowly across Europe, like the soft glow of dawn. Mines used them to pump water, workshops used them to drive mechanical arms, and soon, factories, large wooden or brick buildings filled with rows of machines, began appearing. At first, people were unsure about them. The idea of many workers gathering under one roof to operate spinning frames, looms, and mechanical tools felt unfamiliar. But gradually, the quiet rhythm of factories became the heartbeat of a changing continent. Inside these early factories, the soundscape was unique. It was not the chaotic noise of modern industry. It was steady, repetitive, almost like a mechanical lullaby. Wooden floors vibrated softly. Iron wheels turned with a calm, rhythmic consistency. Steam hissed like a distant teapot, releasing short breaths that seemed almost alive. Workers, men, women, and sometimes children, moved with practiced routine. Many came from small villages, where life had been slower. Their hands, once used to tending fields or crafting goods at home, now guided threads, metal parts, or levers. This migration from countryside to city was one of the biggest social changes Europe ever experienced. Entire families packed their belongings into small bags and walked long distances toward towns that were rapidly growing. New streets were built,
New markets opened. New houses and cramped apartments appeared almost overnight.
These expanding towns were not always clean or comfortable, but they pulsed with opportunity. For many, the idea of regular wages, even if small, felt like a promise of stability in a world that was learning to move faster. Railways entered the scene like long iron rivers crossing the land. When the first trains rolled through the countryside, people watched with a mix of fear and wonder. A wooden carriage pulled by a steam engine seemed unnatural, almost magical. The ground trembled gently as the wheels clattered along the metal rails. Smoke drifted upward in thick gray curls. But the trains brought something Europe had never experienced before: speed. Goods that once took days or weeks to travel could now move across regions in a fraction of the time. Internal trade expanded. Farmers sent crops to distant cities. Coal mines delivered fuel to factories hundreds of miles away. Ironworks shipped metal parts that would become new machines, bridges, or tools. Europe's economy, which had once been slow and seasonal, now pulsed with a steady commercial rhythm. Merchants tracked shipments. Port cities grew wealthier. Banking systems matured. Finance became a powerful engine of growth, allowing big projects to be funded, built, and expanded. In the soft glow of early evening, imagine a European town in the 19th century. The sun has set, but the faint orange light of factory windows spills out onto the streets. A slow fog hangs in the air. The distant puffing of a steam engine blends with the quiet chatter of workers leaving for home. Some carry lunch tins, some carry tools, some simply carry the tired satisfaction of a long day. The town smells of coal, metal, bread, and warm steam. Not pleasant, not unpleasant, just a new scent of a new era. Europe's wealth began multiplying in ways unseen before. It was not simply about money, it was about production. A single machine could spin thread faster than dozens of workers. A steam pump could drain a mine more efficiently than horses and men combined. Railways could transport thousands of tons of goods that once depended on slow-moving caravans. Every small improvement multiplied the continent's economic strength. But this story, told softly for your rest, is not just about machines. It is about people, individuals who learned new skills, families who adapted to modern life, children who grew up hearing the low hum of factories instead of the quiet rustle of farms, cities that learned to breathe through chimneys and railways, governments that began planning for expanding economies, social systems that adjusted to new challenges and opportunities. The Industrial Revolution brought both light and shadow. Working conditions were often hard. Factories could be dangerous. The air in cities became thick. Rivers were polluted. But alongside these struggles was an undeniable sense of progress. New inventions appeared every year. Everyday life improved slowly. Better clothing, better tools, cheaper goods, increased literacy, improved transportation, and eventually better health and sanitation. Imagine a world where communication began to accelerate too. With faster trains, letters traveled quickly. Newspapers spread ideas across countries. Knowledge moved freely, like a gentle wind passing from one town to another. Even the simple experience of time changed. Church bells once marked the rhythm of life, morning, noon, evening. But now, factory whistles and train schedules shaped the day. Time became measured not only by nature, but by machines. Europe entered a new mental era. The belief that life could improve, that humans could invent solutions, that discovery could transform society, this belief began to grow strongly. It was the quiet rise of a modern mindset. People observed. They questioned. And slowly, they built a world that was more connected, more productive, and more confident in human creativity. As the 19th century progressed, factories expanded into almost every corner of Europe. Textile mills, ironworks, shipyards, chemical plants, paper mills, and countless new industries appeared. Cities like Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, Glasgow, Berlin, and Paris grew rapidly. Their skylines filled with chimneys, their rivers carried barges loaded with goods. Their streets bustled with horses, carts, and eventually trams. Each city had its own industrial melody, a soft chorus of wheels, water pumps, steam valves, and human footsteps. Banks grew larger too. Investment houses financed railways, mines, and factories. Insurance companies emerged to protect goods and ships. A whole financial ecosystem formed, supporting and accelerating the industrial machine.
This expanded economic structure allowed Europe to extend its influence across continents through trade, diplomacy, and sometimes force. But tonight, in this calm, sleep-friendly retelling, we focus not on conflict, but on transformation. The Industrial Revolution was a slow unfolding of potential, a story of how simple materials, coal, iron, steam, became instruments of change, a story of how ordinary workers became part of an extraordinary process, a story of how the rhythm of life shifted from the gentle pace of nature to the steady hum of machinery. Let your imagination drift through a soft European night during the height of industrial growth. Street lamps glow dimly. A light mist hangs in the air. The distant silhouette of a factory stands like a quiet giant, breathing steady puffs of steam into the sky. A train passes across an iron bridge, its wheels clicking like the calm ticking of a giant clock. The world is not rushing yet. It is simply adjusting, step by step, to a new rhythm. This economic expansion did not end in one generation. It continued across decades. Each new invention inspired another. Each improvement made production smoother. Each railway connected new towns. And slowly, wealth increased not just for nations, but for ordinary people. Goods became more affordable. Travel became easier. Europe was building not just machines, but the foundations of a modern society. The story of the Industrial Revolution is often told with excitement and speed. But in truth, its early years were slow, steady, and deeply human. Inventors working late at night. Workers learning to use new tools. Cities expanding street by street. It was a transformation fueled by curiosity, effort, and the desire for improvement. So as your mind settles, let the calm hum of this historical journey carry you gently toward rest. The Industrial Revolution was not a sudden storm. It was a long, quiet dawn, revealing a world that was changing, adapting, and growing richer in knowledge, connection, and possibility. As Europe expanded economically, another transformation began, quieter, slower, but far more fundamental. Politics, which once belonged only to kings, emperors, and nobles, gradually opened its doors to ordinary people. Old systems built over centuries started feeling the pressure of a changing society. The Industrial Revolution had shifted populations towards cities. With factories came workers. With workers came voices. And with voices came demands. When people live close together, share the same struggles, and move through the same streets every day, they begin to question power in a new way. Europe was entering a long, reflective conversation with itself, one that would reshape nations. The French Revolution acted like a distant thunderstorm that echoed across the continent. The fall of a monarchy did not just topple a king. It altered how people imagined authority. Ideas of liberty, equality, citizenship, once philosophical concepts, now became tools for political awakening. Even those who feared revolution could not ignore the shift. A seed had been planted, the idea that government should be accountable to its people. Napoleon's rise and expansion carried more than armies. His administration brought new legal codes, standardized systems, and secular governance into regions that had been ruled through old feudal customs. Wherever his influence reached, the question of what a modern state should look like followed. Even after his defeat, the administrative reforms he left behind did not disappear. Meanwhile, cities across Europe were growing louder, not with noise, but with discussion. Coffee houses, universities, newspapers, pamphlets, and public squares became quiet battlegrounds of ideas. Thinkers debated the purpose of government. Writers argued about rights. Workers organized for fair treatment. Philosophers introduced new visions of society. The continent was turning into a laboratory of political thought. Different ideologies began to take form. Liberalism emphasized personal freedoms, elected governments, and constitutional rights. Conservatism focused on tradition, stability, and gradual change. Socialism grew from the struggles of workers, imagining a society where economic fairness mattered as much as political freedom. They simmered silently, influencing generations of thinkers and citizens. Nationalism, too, rose quietly, almost organically. People who shared language, culture, geography, and history began to see themselves as belonging to a collective identity, a nation. This idea was powerful. It inspired unity, but also sparked tension. It helped fracture old empires and ignite movements that would later shape the borders of Europe. Germany and Italy are the greatest examples of this shift.
Dozens of small kingdoms and principalities slowly merged through shared identity, political strategy, and cultural pride. The idea of a nation-state became the new model, large, centralized, and unified. Democracy also took root, though it did not arrive fully formed. At first, only the wealthy could vote, then the middle class, then working men, eventually after long struggles, women as well. Step by step, decade by decade, the concept of citizenship expanded. Parliaments grew stronger, monarchs weakened, constitutions were written, rights were debated, defended, and slowly secured. Labor movements played a quiet but vital role. Factory workers marched, negotiated, and sacrificed to demand safer workplaces, fair wages, reasonable hours, and collective rights. Their struggles laid the groundwork for the modern welfare state: education, healthcare, pensions, public services. The state, once a distant authority, slowly took on responsibility for the lives of its people. Through all of this, Europe's political transformation was not sudden. It was like watching a landscape change with the seasons, barely visible day by day, but unmistakable across generations. A peaceful revolution of thought, law, and identity. Old hierarchies gave way to new institutions. Kings became symbols instead of rulers. Citizens became participants instead of subjects. Nations became organized, stable, and grounded in shared identity rather than inherited power. This was Europe's quiet political awakening, a slow, deliberate reshaping of power, built not by conquerors, but by conversations, demands, debates, and collective memory. A continent that once bowed to emperors now leaned toward democracy. A society once defined by birth now valued citizenship. And in the silence between revolutions, reforms, and rising nations, modern Europe began to take its final shape. The 19th century settled over Europe like a long, thinking pause. The wars were slowing, the factories were humming, and in the quiet in between, people began noticing something deeper. They were no longer just workers or peasants or subjects living under the shadow of ancient crowns. They were becoming something else, something new: citizens. Not everyone felt it at once. The change was subtle, like mist lifting slowly from a valley. A small reform here, a new law there, a debate in Parliament that would have been unthinkable 50 years earlier. But these tiny changes carried a tremendous weight. They hinted that the world was moving away from inherited power and toward something shared, negotiated, agreed upon. In the evenings, when workers walked home through narrow streets lit by weak lanterns, conversations turned toward politics, not the high drama of kings and queens, but the daily concerns of ordinary people: taxes, rights, representation, safety, education, wages. It was the slow birth of public opinion, the beginning of a population that talked back. Newspapers became the heartbeat of this era, cheap enough for workers and loud enough for governments to fear. The sound of pages turning in cafes, factories, and marketplaces was almost like the sound of gears shifting inside a machine. It meant minds were moving, ideas were circulating, and knowledge was no longer locked inside universities or palaces. Universities, too. Young people who once studied Latin and ancient law now studied economics, engineering, medicine, and political science. Professors debated revolutions not as distant events, but as ongoing experiments. Students began to imagine a world that could be organized differently, where fairness was not a privilege, but a principle. In the countryside, the change was slower, but even there, ripples came. Land reforms, new agricultural rights, local councils. Villagers who once bowed silently to landlords now attended meetings, argued respectfully, and voted in small local decisions that affected their fields, their roads, their families. Democracy was not a sudden wave. It was a quiet seep that slowly filled every crack. Meanwhile, Europe's great thinkers were weaving philosophies that would become political foundations. John Stuart Mill spoke of liberty as a natural human pulse. Karl Marx described economic struggle as the engine of historical change. Edmund Burke warned that tradition had value and should not be discarded recklessly. These voices didn't shout at each other. They created the chorus of an age trying to find balance. And ordinary people listened. Different countries walked different paths toward democracy. Britain expanded voting rights step by step. almost cautiously, as if afraid the change might be too loud. France pushed forward in sudden jumps, with revolutions flaring up like storms, then quieting again. Germany, Italy, and the nations of Eastern Europe struggled between old empires and new identities, testing what unity meant in real life, not just on paper. And hovering above all of this was the growing idea of the nation-state, an idea so simple, yet so powerful, that a people connected by language, culture, and memory could govern themselves as one, that loyalty belonged not to a king, but to a shared identity. This idea reshaped maps, dissolved empires, and stitched together small fragments into strong new nations. Germany is the clearest example. For centuries it had been a mosaic of tiny kingdoms, each with its own rules, traditions, and armies. But industrial growth needed larger markets. Shared language created shared stories. And under the guidance of leaders like Bismarck, those hundreds of pieces slowly fit together into a unified shape.
Not gently, not perfectly, but inevitably. Italy followed a similar but more romantic path. Poets, soldiers, and dreamers crossed mountains and fought battles for an idea that one language, one culture, and one history belonged under one flag. Their victories were small at first, almost fragile, but combined, they formed a chorus loud enough to awaken a nation. While new countries were forming, old empires, Austrian, Ottoman, Russian, felt the ground shifting beneath them. Their populations were too diverse, too restless, too informed. Nationalism pushed from below, and reforms tried to hold things together from above. For a while, they managed, but the seeds of change had already been planted. Through all of this, democracy continued to grow quietly. Not perfect, not instant, not evenly, but steadily. Voting rights expanded, parliaments strengthened. Monarchs became ceremonial symbols rather than absolute rulers. In some places, the transition was peaceful. In others, it came through protests or revolutions. But across the continent, the direction was unmistakable. The Industrial Revolution also changed politics in unexpected ways. As factories multiplied and cities expanded, governments began to realize that the health of workers, the safety of children, and the stability of housing were not private matters, they were political issues. Slowly, Europe began building systems of public education, public health, and public welfare. These policies were not born from generosity alone. A healthy worker was a productive worker. An educated citizen was a valuable citizen. But regardless of motive, the result was profound. The state became responsible for the well-being of the people, not because of royal duty, but because of social necessity. The labor movement pushed this further. Workers discovered the power of collective action. Through strikes, marches, union meetings, and long negotiations, they demanded protection. Their voices were sometimes ignored, sometimes crushed, sometimes embraced, but they did not go silent. And eventually, governments had to listen. 8-hour workdays, safety laws, restrictions on child labor. These were new ideas in human history, and Europe was slowly adopting them. By the late 19th century, the political landscape of Europe was almost unrecognizable compared to the world of medieval kings. Cities had parliaments, citizens had opinions, workers had unions, women were demanding the vote, newspapers were shaping debate, nations were rising, empires were trembling, and through all of this, there was a quiet belief taking root, a belief that power should not be inherited, that laws should not be arbitrary, that a government should reflect the people it governs, that identity mattered, that rights mattered, that the future could be built, step by step, vote by vote, reform by reform. Europe's transformation wasn't a single event. It was the long, gentle unfolding of possibility. It happened in universities and in factories, in debates and in dreams, in rebellions and in reforms. It was a slow, persistent movement toward a world where the individual mattered, where society had a voice, and where nations were formed not by crowns, but by collective identity. By the dawn of the 20th century, Europe stood as a continent transformed, wealthy from industry, confident in its politics, firm in its nation-states, divided in its ideologies, hopeful in its future. It was a delicate balance, one that would soon be tested by wars, but that is another story. For now, Europe had completed one of the greatest political shifts in human history, quietly, steadily, almost gracefully, a march from monarchy to citizenship, from subjects to citizens, from scattered kingdoms to modern nations, from centuries of inherited power
to a world defined by participation. The transformation was not loud, it was not sudden. It was a soft evolution, shaped by millions of footsteps, walking toward the same distant horizon, a horizon called democracy.